This week we're going to start talking about the Middle Ages. Some of you are probably really looking forward to doing so. The Middle Ages is a pretty popular time to study in history. It has a lot of really fascinating aspects to it. It lasts for quite some time. This particular period that we're going to be studying, we're going to be talking about the years between 750 and 1000 CE, and hopefully what we do in the next few weeks is that we dispel some myths. I think we have this mythology that surrounds the Middle Ages concerning what it was like to be alive during that time. And so hopefully you learn a few things about what really occurred during that time. To a certain extent, we're somewhat limited in our ability to describe the lives of people who lived during that time because, of course, the majority of people did not actually read or write, and so we have very few records that survive. And oftentimes, especially for the peasant classes and poorer people in particular, we don't have existing records, and therefore what we do know about them often comes through the lens of the upper classes, such as the aristocracy or churchmen. So that colors things a little bit, and we have to keep that in mind as we study the sources from that time period. There's a really interesting story from this time period that I really enjoy, and so I want to share that with you a little bit. In the 9th century, there was a young boy, about 15 years old, named William, and he went to serve at the court of Charles the Bald, who was the king of the Franks at the time. This might be a familiar figure to some of you. He's quite famous. His father was named Bernard, and Bernard was a very powerful noble. His mother was a woman named Duoda. She was really well educated. She was also very dedicated to the church, and she was a very capable woman. And this family in particular kind of exemplifies what is going on with the aristocracy during this time period. The mother, Duoda, administered the family's estates in the south of France, while her husband was actually occupied with the court. He was at court, so she was back at their estates managing those estates. Unfortunately, during that time, politics became kind of a dangerous business. King Charles was fighting with his brothers over who was going to have certain portions of Frankish territories, and so Charles the Bald came to doubt the loyalty of Bernard. And as a result of this, Bernard's son William, this 15-year-old, was sent to Charles' court as a hostage, and his purpose was to ensure that Bernard would stay loyal. Duoda wrote she wrote a letter, kind of a guide for William, to sort of a how to survive court handbook, and she gave him a lot of advice. She wrote to him about how important it was to believe in God. She wrote to him about politics, how to survive in society, how to maintain his loyalty to his family, a lot of these types of things. And she said something to him that was really interesting. She wrote to him, "I caution you to render first to him whose son you are special, faithful, steadfast loyalty as long as you shall live. So I urge you again, most beloved son William, that first of all you love God, then love, fear, and cherish your father." Now we bring this up because what we see happening during this time period is we see that people's loyalties are changing. They're changing, and loyalty to family is becoming increasingly important. And this is going to have an impact on the politics of the day, as well as the way in which empires and kingdoms are divided up. We are going to begin talking about the Byzantine Empire. Around 850, a Byzantine recovery began. If you will recall, the Byzantine Empire has been in decline for quite some time. But this recovery is driven by a new military organization. Themes continued to protect the provinces, but new mobile armies of elite troops stopped merely defending territory and began to advance on the Islamic Empire, and so they're getting some of their territory back. By 1025, Byzantine victories extended the empire from the Danube to the Euphrates. So this is an important development in the history of the Byzantine Empire. These victories gave new prestige and wealth to the army and imperial court. And so you recall that in past centuries, the prestige of these institutions has been in decline as people are attempting to protect their own wealth and their families. And emperors were able to collect revenues from vast imperial estates, along with taxes and services in lieu of taxes from the general population. So there were several ways in which the general population was able to contribute to the empire, and this included taxes and services. The emperors gained additional wealth from a prosperous agricultural economy organized for trade. We are seeing increased agriculture, better agricultural practices, and this is in turn contributing to greater and better trade. Now, Byzantine commerce involved direct imperial control of craft and commercial guilds, as well as entrepreneurial organization of markets. And this is important because we see direct government intervention in these things. Markets organized by entrepreneurs actually attracted foreign merchants and a steady stream of commodities that ensured imperial revenues. And this helped to really bolster the coffers of the empire. Because trade was intermingled with foreign policy, the Byzantine government considered trade a political as well as an economic matter. It was really important to the empire, important to its political stability, its economic stability, and so this is why we see Byzantine commerce having the hand of the empire so heavily involved in it. Byzantine foreign trade was important, and it flourished throughout the Middle East, Western Europe, and with the Kievan Rus. And we're going to see the Kievan Rus become quite a bit more important. And so here we see a map that shows the gains that have been made by the Byzantine Empire during this period. In the dark green, we have a Byzantine Empire that looks considerably better than we saw it in the prior week. And in the light green, it's grown even more. We see it making inroads up into the Balkans, up into Eastern Europe, as well as much closer to Persia and some of those areas that it had formerly controlled. Now this image, this is the crowning of Constantine, and this image conveys Constantine's piety. We can see that in the way that Constantine bows to Jesus, which is really interesting considering what we know about Constantine's conversion and the controversy that exists over its sincerity. We also see that Jesus is empowered to crown Constantine, a very interesting development. Now, why would this have been important? Constantine was religious, even though we do have this controversy of historical interpretation of his actions. And he most likely wished to show the people of his empire that he was pious, because again, he is legitimizing his own power through religion. This piety was a qualification for rule during this time. And this image empowers Constantine's reign. It suggests that God wants Constantine to rule. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Symbol and ritual were key components of Byzantine rule. Now, with the empire regaining its military strength and the court remembering Byzantium's past glory, the Byzantine emperors revived classical intellectual pursuits. Basil I reigned from 867 to 886. He reigned from Macedonia, he was from Macedonia, and he founded the Imperial dynasty of the period known as the Macedonian Renaissance. Renaissance literally means rebirth. And that period is typically, you'll find that historians will give the years 870 to 1025 as the years of the Macedonian Renaissance. This Renaissance was centered in Constantinople, and was largely driven by the rebirth of the study of classics. This rebirth was advanced by an intellectual elite who had continued to study classics over the preceding century, despite the trend toward a religious education, and we've talked about that in the previous weeks. New artistic works flourished under the sponsorship of emperors, as well as members of the imperial court who served as patrons to writers, philosophers, and historians. And so we see that many of these people who are becoming prosperous and have a lot of money are sponsoring some of these more artistic and scholarly endeavors. Icons were allowed, the iconoclasm is over, and the classical and Christian traditions actually merged in manuscript illuminations of religious writings. Now we have the emergence of an interesting new trend. Alongside the scholarly and artistic elite in Byzantium, we have a new elite group that formed in the countryside. In border regions, powerful military families that we called the Dynatoi, these military families thrived. They had been enriched by booty taken in conflicts with neighboring peoples, and as well as the acquisition of new lands. Some families, notably the Phocas family in the 10th century, gained independent power that actually rivaled that of the emperors. In fact, Nicephorus Phocas was declared emperor by his armies and reigned from 963 to 969. The Dynatoi took over entire villages, and they used peasant labor for their advantage. Overall, the social organization of the empire became more like Western Europe, and what we see happening is rural aristocratic lords begin to control lands as well as the peasantry, and they wielded considerable political power. By 800, we have Bulgarian rulers known as Khagans, presiding over large territories of Slavic settlement from the Danube to Greece, as well as from the Black Sea to Croatia. The Byzantine conquest of Greece and the Balkans represented some interesting developments. Byzantine expansion under Nicephorus I, who reigned from 802 to 811, established control over Greece and led to conflict with Bulgaria, as well as the emperor's death in battle. After a peace was established in 816, an intermittent peace lasted about 30 years. However, Basil II, who reigned from 976 to 1025, notice that 1025 is the end of the Renaissance, this led a methodical conquest of the Balkans, which in turn led to the spread of Byzantine religion and culture to the region, including the development of a precursor to the modern Cyrillic alphabet. So some significant developments there, particularly for Eastern Europe. The region that would become Russia lay outside the sphere of direct Byzantine rule in the 9th and 10th centuries. In the 9th century, Vikings imposed their rule. Moving southward, they took control of the key commercial region around Kiev and settled as the Rus. So many people don't realize that the Vikings were very significant in settling some of these areas. From Kiev, the Rus sailed across the Black Sea in search of markets for trade. So they're moving from conquest toward trade. The relationship between Rus and Byzantium began with trade, but was interrupted by war when the Byzantines tried to use the Rus to attack the neighboring Khazars. The plan actually backfired, and the Khazars forced the Rus to attack Constantinople in 941. Soon, however, the Rus regrouped and resumed trading with Byzantium. So we've got a lot of back and forth going on here. Good relations between the Rus and the Byzantines were solidified when Rus leader Vladimir, who reigned from 978 to 1015, converted to Christianity. A close alliance developed, and this alliance tied the Rus closer to Byzantine culture, especially their form of Christianity, and this helps explain why many parts of Eastern Europe don't adhere, even still today, to Roman Christianity, but are largely Eastern forms of Orthodox Christianity. In 1054, the death of Yaroslav the Wise led to the division of the Rus kingdom between his sons. And civil wars followed, of course, as so often happens when you start dividing kingdoms among sons. Outside invasions also weakened the Kievan rulers of the Rus, who were displaced by rulers from the north. And so, just to give you an idea of the geography of this particular area, this gives you an idea of the proximity of Constantinople to some of these Slavic areas. And here we have a map that shows the development of the Kievan Rus and its expansion outwards. Now we're going to begin discussing what I find to be one of the most fascinating periods in Western history. Civil war in 750 brought down the Umayyads that we've discussed in the past. And if you recall, the Umayyads were Muslim. As a result of this, we have the establishment of the Abbasids as the new Caliphate. They found support in an uneven coalition of Shiites. If you recall, the Shia are one of the major sects of Islam. And so they found support from Shia as well as from non-Arabs who had been excluded from the Umayyad power structure. The empire's capital moved from Damascus to Baghdad. And Baghdad at that time was a fairly new city, while the empire actually became increasingly centralized. Now, the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809, built a wealthy trading system, but the empire actually began to decline after his death even so. Harun al-Rashid's two sons fought a civil war, and the empire lost control of many regions. The empire recruited a mercenary army of freed slaves, many of whom were Turks skilled at firing arrows from horseback. And this was rather devastating, but the Abbasid tax base was inadequate to support the huge army and complex civil administration. So just as we saw with Rome, the Abbasid Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, was put under pressure by its military and civil administrative needs. Excuse me. By the 10th century, the caliphs were figureheads, and regional governors with their own mercenary armies wielded independent power and fragmented the caliphate. Now, the caliphate lost its unity in part because the initial conquest had brought in many ethnicities. Brought in many of these ethnicities into one empire, and that put a lot of internal pressure. Many of these ethnicities practiced different customs and identified with different regions. The Sunni Shiite split also generated polarization. If you'll recall, these are the two major sects of Islam, and they had considerable differences with one another, and this caused tension as well within the Islamic world. As political and religious unity fragmented, local traditions and local rulers became increasingly important, and this helps to contribute to the localization that is happening throughout Western Europe. In Egypt, the Shiite Fatamid dynasty allied with a group of North American Berbers, and by 909 they ruled Tunisia. They claimed descent from Ali. If you'll recall, Ali was the son-in-law of Muhammad. And they also claim to be the Mahdi, who was the divinely guided Messiah. This is a very complex idea, and this was one of those things that helped to contribute to this split between Islamic sects. Fatimid rulers controlled Egypt by 969, and their empire with its lavish court extended to North Africa, Arabia, and Syria, and we can see that it covered large amounts of territory. Sunni Muslims ruled Islamic southern and central Spain with a capital at Córdoba, and Córdoba is going to be incredibly important to the development of Western civilizations. Córdoba was an independent Islamic state that dated from the original conquest of the region in 756. The Córdoba Emirate was originally led by Abd al-Rahman, who was a member of the Umayyad family. The empire was rather diverse and included many Jews and Christians who were allowed freedom of worship and sometimes adopted Arab lifestyle and customs. And this is really important because this Cordoba sort of encapsulated a much more cosmopolitan world in which there was an incredible exchange of ideas, and you see a flowering of culture and art that occurs during the Abbasid Caliphate, especially in Cordoba. Now, the Caliphate broke up in 1031 and local rulers seized power. And so, just to give you an idea of the complexities that are occurring, at least geographically, this is a map that shows the Islamic Emirates and Caliphates and other states that are developing in this part of the world. And so we can see that this is made even more complex when you consider that these different regions are being ruled by different sects of Islam. And so if you have always thought that Islam was this monolithic religion, this should give you some idea of how that is not the case. Now, this is an interesting piece of tableware that was produced during the Fatamid era, and I want you to look for the signature. You'll see it in the upper right corner, um, and I want you to think about why the artist would have signed this work, because of course it's tableware, and I don't know about you, but my dishes, except maybe having a manufacturer's mark, are not necessarily signed by an artist. Um, and so the significance of this can be interpreted in different ways. So, for example, we do know that artists were held in high esteem in this Islamic culture. And so this is an indication that it was a mark of pride. You produce this work, you sign your name to it. The signature also testifies to the importance of the artist's piece, and the artist would have wanted to take credit for that plate. Um, Now, how might this piece illustrate the threat that Fatimid society posed to Sunni rulers in the East? Uh, some of the things to think about is that the skill and time that were devoted to luxury items like this plate suggests that this was a prosperous and peaceful society, and this was a society that could challenge the Sunnis and attract more followers. And so it's I guess you could say it is a symbol of the tension that characterized the Islamic world. Trade networks, as well as religion and a shared language, allowed for cultural unity in the politically fragmented Islamic world. Arabic was the language of the Quran, continues to be the language of the Quran, and it was used in both commerce and government throughout the Islamic world. Although every region had its own political and commercial system, borders were open, and contact and travel were an important feature of Islamic life. Islamic society supported vast international trade networks and were very important in the economy of the Western world. Muslim merchants engaged in trade with England, Timbuktu, Central Africa, and Russia, and so we can see that they were everywhere. We have another example of a piece of craft work in this particular piece, and I want you to think about how this piece would portray the power of the Caliph and his family. Now, this is a very intricate piece, and it would have been rather expensive to produce. It's very beautiful, but some of the things to think about is that the Caliph was able to enjoy peace and prosperity due to some relative peace during that time. And the lions are symbols of power, while servants are present to attend to his whims. So we can see servants in attendance on the Caliph and his family. Pieces like this were often given to caliphs as diplomatic gifts from African leaders, suggesting that the caliph had a lot of influence throughout this region. Now, very few of these actually survive. They were rare, and few people could really do this kind of incredibly detailed artistic carving. This piece in particular is made of ivory, and the material that the pyxis is carved from, ivory, was very valuable and usually used only for royals. Political fragmentation multiplied centers of learning and culture. Libraries were established at Córdoba and in the Abbasid Caliphate, and ancient writings from Persia, India, and Greece were preserved and studied. This is an incredibly important development in the history of Western civilizations. This is going to spread out from the Abbasids to the rest of the world, and they were instrumental in preserving these very important works, very important ancient works. In mathematics, we have the contributions of a man named al-Khwarizmi. He wrote books on algebra and developed Arabic numbers. And so if you didn't know this, algebra was actually invented by an Islamic scholar. The new independent Islamic rulers also supported science and medicine. Physics and natural sciences were also all studied. So this time period is really important in the development of science and mathematics. Rich Muslims established schools as a sign of charity and piety. The Quran and other literary and legal texts were closely studied, but only by men. Islamic scholars made widespread use of cheap paper, which made their scholarship more widely available. And so oftentimes we talk about how important, and we will talk about this later in the semester, we'll talk about the importance of the printing press and its contribution towards universal literacy and the spread of ideas. But without the introduction of paper into Western civilization, the printing press never would have occurred. And so we have paper being brought over from China by the Abbasids and being introduced into the Western world. So, an important development. Now we're going to begin talking about the Carolingian Empire, and you probably have heard of some of these folks. They've been very significant in the development of Western civilizations. And we begin with a man named Charles Martel. He was a palace mayor of the Merovingian kings. We've talked about the Merovingian kings, and Charles Martel used his position as well as his victory over a Muslim invasion from Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus was in what we now know of as Spain. And this Muslim invasion from Al-Andalus occurred around 732. Now, Martel used this invasion to gain support and establish his family as leading aristocrats. He was very successful at this, and as a result, he gained power and influence by turning other aristocratic factions against each other. He was very smart politically, and he allied his family with influential religious and political institutions. The Carolingians, we get the term Carolingian, we derive it from the name of Charles Martel. The Carolingians cooperated with the Roman papacy to extend its influence as well as the hierarchical structures of the church. Charles Martel's son, Pippin III, deposed the Merovingian king in 751. So Martel began to accumulate power, and Pippin III built on that and was able to get rid of the Merovingian king and replace him with a Carolingian dynasty. And even as he did so, it's interesting because Pope Zachary legitimized this act. And so we see the church and we see the Carolingians working in concert with one another. The papacy and the Carolingians depended on each other for support. And this ended the papacy's close connection to the Byzantine Empire while establishing the Pope as a territorial monarch over parts of Italy. The Carolingian dynasty's partnership with the papacy gave the dynasty a Christian aura. Now we're going to begin discussing a character from history that you're probably familiar with. I'm guessing that 99% of you have heard of Charlemagne at some point in your lives. He was known as Charles the Great or Charlemagne. Charlemagne is Charles the Great in French. Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814, and he had a very complex, sometimes contradictory, and sometimes brutal character. He had a unifying vision of an empire that would unite the Germanic, Roman, and Christian worlds, and he was very successful at it. Charlemagne's early career was marked by conquest. He invaded Lombard Italy and annexed northern Italy by 774. In the north, he fought a very difficult 30-year war against the Saxons, but he was victorious and, as a result, was converted them to Christianity at sword point. In the southeast, he fought the Avars in a campaign that brought a lot of treasure and riches. In the southwest, he created a buffer zone between his kingdom and Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is in what we know of today as Spain. By the 790s, Charlemagne ruled vast territories. Again, he was very successful in his campaigns. He imitated the Roman imperial model by sponsoring symbolic building programs and patronizing science and the arts. But it's important to note that while he took on a lot of these Roman ways, this is the beginning of a new era in Western history. So it's not merely a continuation of the old Roman model. So to discourage corruption, he appointed special officials known as missi dominici, from the Latin, and these missi dominici oversaw the activities of regional governors. Now, Charlemagne had an interesting relationship with the church, and we're going to see linkages being made between the church and his kingdom. In return for his support of Pope Leo III, Pope Leo III had been charged with adultery and perjury claims by the Roman aristocracy, and Charlemagne supported Pope Leo III, and this enabled him to sort of stem off being deposed. This occurred about 799, and as a result of this support, Pope Leo and Charlemagne became closely linked. Leo proclaimed Charlemagne emperor. However, Charlemagne actually claimed not to want the title. Part of it was that he didn't want the church to be in a position where they could declare him emperor. He felt that he was the higher power, not the church. But in the end, this really worked out for him. And so to give you an idea of how that expansion of the Carolingian Empire occurred under Charlemagne, if you look in the upper right corner, we see some interesting developments. This is the division of the empire by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. And so the main portion of the map, we see how large the Carolingian Empire had become, and we can see how Charlemagne added to that by 814. As well as in yellow, we have these provinces that owe tribute to Charlemagne. And then, of course, in the green, we can see where the Byzantine Empire lay. And by 843, of course, Charlemagne, once he passed away, we see the division of his territories by his sons, and it's, again, that old story. With the emergence of the Carolingians, and Charlemagne in particular, we have another renaissance. The Carolingians inaugurated a revival of learning, and it was designed to enhance the glory of the kings, as well as to educate their officials, reform the liturgy of the church, and purify Christianity. So it has these really lofty goals. Roman learning was revived by scholars, and the English scholar Alcuin was recruited with others to form a center of study and bring Anglo-Saxon scholarship to the Carolingian court. And so we see the emergence of schools, and education and literacy become increasingly important. Not by any means widespread. For the most part, most of the population is still limited to any kind of exposure to literacy, writing, reading. Churches and cathedrals were ordered to teach reading and writing to all. Although, as I've just said, this plan was never really advanced, but it was a goal of the Carolingians to expand literacy throughout their kingdom. Art in the service of the king actually it was influenced by Byzantine practices, and it thrived during this time period. Long after the Carolingian dynasty had ended, their mode of inquiry and scholastic endeavors continued in monastic schools for generations, and these monastic schools are eventually going to become universities during the Middle Ages. Manuscript handwriting was actually standardized during this time. If you didn't realize it, handwriting was not standard. Fonts weren't standard, and we're still going to see problems with this. Even into early modern Europe, spelling and handwriting was by no means standard throughout. But during the Carolingians, we're going to see the beginnings of this process as handwriting in manuscripts is standardized. This meant that manuscript study was easier for future scholars. And so, if you've ever tried to read something, an old document from the past, it can be a challenge if it's not something that you're accustomed to. But that standardization, once you learn it, makes it very easy to read these manuscripts. Now, as we saw from one of the previous maps, we have some developments that occur upon Charlemagne's death. Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious, who reigned from 814 to 840, came to the throne when his father died of fever. He took his role as the leader of the Christian Empire very seriously, hence the name Louis the Pious. He was a strong promoter of Benedictine monasticism. His firstborn son, Lothar, was made co-emperor, and his other sons, Pippin and Louis, were made sub-kings. When Louis remarried after his wife Ermengarde's death and had another son, Charles, in 823, his other children actually rebelled, and they fought their father and one another for more than a decade. So really, really interesting that you have this father who's having to deal with really rebellious sons. And, if you were the average family, this wouldn't be so much of a big deal, except that this was the Carolingian kings. After Louis's death in 840, the Treaty of Verdun was struck in 843, and it divided the empire among Louis's three remaining sons. Charles the Bald, who reigned from 843 to 877, received the western third. This would be present-day France. Louis the German reigned from 843 to 876, received the eastern third, which is present-day Germany. And the Middle Kingdom, called the Middle because it was in the middle between France and Germany, it was given to Lothar, who reigned from 840 to 876. And Lothar also gained the imperial title. The success of Charlemagne's empire had been based on the loyalty of a small group of privileged aristocrats, laymen, and churchmen alike, with lands and offices across the realm. Their loyalty was based on shared values, friendship, expectation of gain, as well as formal ties of vassalage and fealty. Once the empire had been divided into three realms and the borders fixed, the aristocrats lost their expectations of new lands and offices. And so the way to think about this is that, in large part, the way that Charlemagne gained his support is that as he conquered territories, he gave a lot of land and wealth to his supporters. And so it was in your best interest to support him because you might get quite a bit out of it. But once Charlemagne dies and things become a little bit splintered, there was less opportunity for that, and that helped to kind of contribute to the decline of the Carolingians. Now, for the aristocrats, what this meant is that they put down roots in particular regions and began to gather their own followings. So we're going to see, as we've discussed in the Islamic world, we see localization. This is also going to contribute to localization of power. Many people had never shared the vision of a powerful Christian empire, but instead valued family and local loyalties more. So as I talked to you at the beginning of this lecture about the story of Bernard and his son, that we have this interesting development that's occurring in which people are putting local loyalties first. Powerful local traditions, including different languages, also undermined imperial unity, and so we're going to see the development of different dialects. Now, let's talk about life under the Carolingian Empire. We've talked a lot about the elite, and so let's talk about sort of what was going on in the rest of society. Carolingian wealth actually came largely from booty. Booty is, of course, the acquisition of treasure through conquest, and so a lot of wealth was gained this way. But trade with the Abbasid Caliphate was also important to the economy. So the Carolingians coexist with the Abbasids. The collapse of that empire may have weakened the Carolingians. Land was the most important source of wealth and power. Carolingian aristocrats held many estates scattered throughout the Frankish Empire that were reorganized into productive units that modern historians call manors. And the root of that word is actually domain. And domain is actually also the root word of domain is spelled Desmesne, and that word is a French word that is also actually the root of the word domain. On Carolingian manors, families of peasants worked the land of their lords as well as their own small plots. Parents subdivided their plots to provide land for their adult children, so already you can kind of see that there is going to be a problem with this. Peasants used the more efficient three-field system, and the three-field system left a third of their land fallow as opposed to half, which had been customary prior to this. Peasants owed dues and services to their lords. Farming was profitable during this time, but it provided little in the way of surplus, and the system of scattered manors actually weakened the defense of the empire. So I really love this diagram of a manor that demonstrates how a three-field system works. As you can see, we've got three fields. We've got the autumn sowing, the spring sowing, and then we've got the fallow field. And we can see the rotation. And so these would rotate. So one year you would have the autumn sowing and the spring sowing up above, with the fallow field down in the lower quadrant. And that next year everything would rotate to the right. And in doing this, it allowed the fallow field to recover from being exhausted by having been planted with crops. Fallow fields, if you know anything about agriculture, in the absence of a lot of fertilizers, the nutrients in the soil become exhausted and are in need of being replenished. And so if you left a field fallow, you would allow that field to replenish its nutrients. And as I said before, we are getting into some really interesting history, and so we're going to start talking about Vikings now. Vikings moved westward out of the Gulf of Finland from the end of the 8th century, and what they were seeking was prestige, profit, land, treasure, all of these things. And they often traveled in family groups, despite what we often think of as Viking invasions. They were expert navigators, venturing as far as Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. We have a lot of evidence that they made it to North America. They settled in northeast England and raided the British Isles regularly until they were defeated by Alfred the Great in 878. And their invasions of England were quite devastating. They devastated Ireland as well, and so they would come in and they would just burn whole villages, and a lot of treasures, a lot of books were actually lost during this time period. Vikings settled and traded where they originally raided, and by 850 they began to control some regions. Rollo, who was a Viking leader in France, accepted Christianity and gained control of the region of France that was called Normandy. Norman, some of you may know, comes from the term Norseman. Christian missionaries had also begun to move into Scandinavia, so we do have an exchange going on here. It wasn't just the Vikings coming down from the north, but it was also Christians moving up to the north. Danish kings who had converted to Christianity created the Kingdom of Denmark, and during the 10th and 11th centuries, the Danes expanded their control to parts of Sweden, Norway, and England. Around the same time, Muslims began to attack southern Europe. They set up bases in the Mediterranean and a stronghold in Provence for a time before they were expelled by Christians outraged at the kidnapping of an abbot named Maiolus. And Maiolus came from the abbey at Cluny. It is a very famous abbey, very old abbey. To the east, we have a group of Magyars raiding into Germany, as well as Italy and Gaul, between the years 899 and 955. This ended with the German king Otto I. He defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld. The Magyars were contained and later converted to Christianity as a result. All of these invading groups, similar to those who had attacked the Roman Empire, we've talked about that before, these groups came for wealth, but as they came into these Western cultures, they later adopted aspects of Western culture, especially as they remained in the region. And so you see a lot of cultural exchange going on as a result of these invasions. And this is a great map that shows the progression of these invasions. They're just all over the place, and so life was not really it was not that great, especially if you lived along these coastal regions. These coastal regions in particular were quite devastated. But in some parts of the Western world, it wasn't that great to live in land either. Magyar invasions happened particularly in Eastern Europe, and were quite devastating. And we also see that some invasions coming from the north were also able to move inland. Personal and local loyalties were the most important thing in this era. The Carolingian system depended on networks of relationships between kings and their fidelis. Fidelis is a Latin term, and it means faithful men. These fidelis received a share of the revenues of their administrative districts as well as fiefs. Fiefs were land grants. Carolingian counts distributed fiefs to loyal supporters, and by the end of the 9th century, fiefs were often passed on to heirs. So initially, fiefs were not inheritable, but as these families gain more power, they are also gaining inheritance rights to these lands and territories. Warriors increasingly became vassals of local lords. And as a result, they created a social and economic system that some historians call feudalism. Now, feudalism is kind of a troublesome term, and it was by no means uniform throughout Western civilizations. But there are some relatively common, and I use the word common loosely, but there were some common features of this system. Society was divided into 3 segments. We have those who prayed, we have those who fought, and we have those who worked. And so these were really important divisions in society, and each individual had a role to play in ensuring the stability of society. So those who prayed ensured the stability of society because as they prayed, they were gaining the support of God, in the endeavors of the people that they prayed for, and so this helped to assure stability in the minds of those who believed in this system. Those who fought, of course, their responsibility was to defend, and so in a region that is troubled by invasion, these are really important people. And those who worked. Now, those who worked comprised the majority of the population. Those who fought would have been the aristocracy and their militaries, while those who worked would have been, for example, the peasant farmers. Tradesmen might have been included in that, but in general, the peasantry. And so Their job was to provide for the food and goods that society needed. Vassalage, which also involved lords serving as the vassals of others, strengthened what remained of public power. So, not a lot of public power left, but because of the localization, but vassalage helped to preserve that. And it allowed local lords to muster troops as well as to collect taxes and administer justice. Vassalage offered the poor some opportunity for protection and reward. Now, interestingly, women participated in the system as wives and mothers of vassals, who promised loyalty or fealty by offering homage or service in exchange for protection, and this happened in a very public ceremony. So let's talk about those who worked. Peasants made up the majority of the population, but they were at the bottom of the social scale. Peasants increasingly became dependent on the lords of manors as serfs, especially as life became more violent and life became more tenuous. And serfdom was an inherited rather than a voluntary dependency. This inherited status involved serfs laboring on their lord's land and paying taxes to him. The standard of living for all gradually improved as the climate warmed and better agricultural techniques came into use. And I didn't mention it earlier, but a lot of these improvements in agricultural techniques were driven by developments in the Abbasid Caliphate, particularly irrigation techniques. These were really important. Some peasants began to pay money to landlords rather than goods and labor. And this was a change that worked to the advantage of both landlords and peasants. Bounded villages were surrounded by farms, and these villages had a strong sense of a strong sense of community that grew up around churches. These were interdependent communities of peasants, although they often had conflicting loyalties and obligations in relation to local lords, as you can imagine. Authority and power became increasingly localized as it fell into the hands of aristocrats. Many of these aristocrats were based in castles. In southern France, for example, virtually independent castellans extended their authority in some cases, conquering other castles in order to dominate a region and subjecting all who lived near their castles to vassalage, as well as serfdom, taxation, and most importantly, their judicial regime. So when you have judicial power, you have a lot of power. Castellans formed relationships with other large landowners. They also supported local monasteries and appointed local priests. The development of virtually independent local political units that were dominated by a castle and controlled by a military elite, this meant that the social, political, and cultural life of Europe was now dominated by landowners who were both military men as well as regional rulers. Although knights and their lords were differentiated by rank, they all shared a common way of life. Knights and their lords were warriors who fought on horseback and wore armor. Their armor and the adoption of horseshoes and stirrups allowed knights to fight better. They could also travel farther, and they used heavier weapons than ever before. Lords and their vassals often lived, ate, hunted, and fought together. They also competed against one another in military games. These military games you might be familiar with from movies, tourneys or tournaments. Unmarried knights who lived with their lords were called youths, and it didn't matter how old they were still youths. Their perpetual status as bachelors actually reflected a change in families and inheritance. So think about this: if you're a lord or and you have multiple sons, what do you do? What do you do about inheritance? So, especially if you don't want your lands and territories to be broken up into increasingly smaller and smaller pieces. This means that if you have multiple sons, you have a problem. What do you do with those younger sons or the sons that weren't going to inherit? Becoming a knight was something that was an option. And so this is why this reflects a change. This is how we know that there have been some changes occurring. Now, diminished opportunities to own land because of primogeniture. This is the recognition of the primary claim of a family's oldest sons on the family's landed property. This, as discussed, left younger sons seeking careers as knights, or they could seek careers in the church. This is a patrilineal system. This is what we call a patrilineal system, in which sons inherit from their fathers. This actually caused aristocratic women to lose power, because this hadn't always been the case. Women in the past were able to inherit power, but now they're not able to inherit power. That power is connected to property, and property is going to the oldest son. And so, although widows and daughters could inherit property and wives might act as lands while their husbands were away, we do see the beginning of a decline in women's status. Marriage still played an important part, however, in offering women an important social role. Now, this social system had significant impacts, and one of those impacts is that we have increased violence, and that increased violence devastated cities and the countryside in particular. Bishops, counts, and peasants all attempted to limit conflict by imposing what was called the Peace of God. This was a movement that began in France around 990 and quickly spread by 1050 over a wide region. Excommunication was the threat. The peace of God meant that if you stole property or seized peasants, you would be excommunicated. Now, why is this important? Why would this have any kind of a deterrent effect on violence? Well, if you are Christian, your salvation depends on, not only your salvation, but your life in the hereafter depends on your status as a Christian. And to be excommunicated meant that in the hereafter you had a problem. Now, the effectiveness of the peace of God was variable, and it didn't necessarily stem the violence as people had hoped. So there was a second set of agreements called the Truce of God. The Truce of God was designed to prevent fighting between warriors and prohibited fighting on days of religious significance. It was meant to be enforced by local lords who took a sacred oath to do so. Other efforts were also made locally to limit violence, including assemblies where lords and vassals mediated wars and feuds. So let's switch now, and we're going to talk about Italy, England, and France. In Italy, cities remained the primary centers of power. Italian elites tended to build estates within walled cities that also contained churches, with the cities controlling the surrounding countryside. A currency economy thrived here, and the cities became centers of commerce and trade. Italian family life rejected primogeniture, so you're not going to see oldest sons inheriting in these Italian cities. And these Italian cities are going to become Italian city-states eventually. This meant that there were shared opportunities among the male members of families, and this was a model for later Italian business and banking ventures. These ventures are going to have a significant impact on the course of events in the Renaissance as well as in the Middle Ages. England remained largely rural. Alfred the Great was the king of Wessex. He fortified settlements and built a mobile army and navy. He reformed religion and supported scholarly translations of religious works into Anglo-Saxon. So really important because this puts it in a language that many people can understand. However, Latin still remained the language of governance and the church. He issued a law code, and he and his successors rolled back Danish control over parts of the country, and they were really successful at that. England became united and organized under a strong ruler. His grandson Edgar reigned from 957 to 975, and he had the sworn loyalty of the great men of the kingdom and controlled ecclesiastical appointments. Even so, royal control was tenuous, and the Danish king Knut conquered England and ruled from 1017 to 1035. Canute reinforced the cultural connection between England and Scandinavia. Going over the channel to France, France was a larger realm and struggled to cope with invasions. They have a lot of coastline, and this meant that these areas were particularly vulnerable to invasions. As the Carolingian dynasty waned at the end of the 10th century, a man named Hugh Capet, he was a powerful aristocrat and was chosen by the most powerful dukes, counts, and bishops to rule in 987. So there was a coalition of the most important people in the church as well as in the aristocracy in giving him power. He reigned until 996, establishing the Capetian dynasty. The Capetian monarchs had scattered estates and limited power, as independent castellans controlled many areas, so their power was not absolute in these areas, but they represented the idea of unity inherited from Charlemagne, and therefore they enjoyed considerable prestige. So here we have a map of what we know of today as the British Isles. It doesn't contain all of the British Isles, but we can see at least England here, and we can see the Kingdom of Wessex down in the south, and this is the area from which Alfred expanded outward and was able to push out the Danish and establish control over much of this area. And this is another map that shows the Capetian monarchy, and the Ile-de-France in blue is going to be increasingly important in subsequent chapters. So pay attention to that area and its role in France. Now, going further east to Germany, Germany was by no means a cohesive state identity like we see today, but it was consolidated by its Ottonian kings, who styled themselves as emperors. They ruled over 5 large duchies. These kings were elected by the dukes, in part to better resist Magyar invasions from the east, and so those external pressures are helping the Germans to set up their own sort of unique political system. Otto I was a great military hero who conquered Lombard Italy in 951 and defeated a Magyar army in 955. This helped to solidify his dynasty, which continued to resist Slavic invasion. So this is a dynasty that is being further strengthened by these external pressures. So the Ottonians have the support of their people as long as they're helping to resist some of these invasions. Otto I claimed the Middle Kingdom carved out by the Treaty of Verdun and had himself proclaimed emperor in 962. His successors, Otto II and Otto III, were chosen through patrilineal descent, and they had to cope with family revolts supported by aristocratic factions. So there is some internal pressures as well that these Ottonian monarchs are having to deal with. They did have harmonious relations with the church. They empowered bishops as royal officials and participated in their selection. And this is going to set up, while it worked during this time period, is going to set up some conflicts with the church eventually. The Ottonians and their Salian successors supported learning, and German noblewomen were well educated and even supported artists and scholars, interestingly enough. The monarchy made use of ministerials. These were specially designated serfs, and they administered the kingdom. German influence also expanded further to the east. Supported by the church, German kings created new Catholic polities on their eastern frontier. The Czechs, under the rule of Václav, for example, converted and came into the German sphere of influence. The Polanians, under Mieszko I, accepted baptism in order to forestall German attack and placed their people under the protection of the Pope. Under Mieszko's son, Boleslav, Poland's borders expanded to Kiev, and Boleslav became a king with the Pope's blessing. Magyars settled Hungary under Stephen the First. They also accepted Christianity, and Stephen was crowned in 1000 or 1001 by the Pope. So to finish up the lecture, we're going to just take a look at a couple of maps really quick. I want you to take a look at this one. This is the Ottonian Empire between the years 936 and 1002, and you can see how far it extended under Otto the First, as well as the additional territories that it incurred by the time of Otto the Third. And in the regions that are cross-hatched, you can see those regions that became dependent on the Ottonians. Now, in this map, this just kind of gives us a view of what Europe and the Mediterranean look like by the end of this period that we're talking about. So we see a lot of fragmentation going on. This is by no means cohesive as we saw under the Romans. There's a lot of different political entities, and this kind of gives you an idea of why talking about this uniform system of feudalism is really problematic, because each of these political entities had different ways of governance. And so while they kind of shared some very similar features, such as the increasing importance of serfdom as an economic system, there are significant differences.